One thing that we've not really mentioned so far is functions within Sass, other than comparing mixins to functions. But Sass does actually have some built-in functions that can be very useful, if you know that they exist and how to use them, that is. There are far too many functions to cover in this single video, so instead of trying to give you a poor quality video, we're just going to have a look at some of them and think about when they may be useful. After that, we're going to look at another strength of Sass, which is the ability to create conditional styles which can help you to create more robust styles. Finally, after looking at conditional styles, we're going to take a quick look at some of the general options of Sass and how they can impact your workflow. So let's look at functions first. As I mentioned, there are far too many different functions to talk about them all, but if you go to the Sass homepage and click on Documentation and Functions, you'll see this list of functions built into Sass. Because functions aren't really what styles are about, you can't create any functions yourself very easily, but the plethora of built-in functions will almost always have an answer to whatever you want to do, so let's take a look at them. As you can see from the first few functions mentioned in the documentation, many of the functions revolve around colours, mixing them in the exact manner that you want to, through controlling things like lightness, saturation, transparency, and a whole bunch of other functions. After the colour related functions, we have functions related to strings and manipulating strings. You may be wondering why you would ever want to use some of these functions, but when you combine them with variables, you can create very exact and properly formatted styles from variables, without losing the flexibility you gain from using variables in the first place. For example, you can combine a group of variables to format a font to your exact specifications, using the one-line CSS font property, which requires quotation marks around the name of the font family, for example. Next up we have the number functions. These are likely going to be used more commonly than the string functions we've just talked about, mostly because CSS uses numbers more commonly than it uses strings. As an example of when you may want to use some of these functions, you may be styling your website based on the assumption your users will use 1920 by 1080 resolution, and you may want to split your entire screen into 7 columns, and so you assign a width of an element to 1920 divided by 7, without actually performing the calculation yourself. Sass will calculate that for you, but the result of that calculation isn't a whole number, so you may want to round up or down so that your style is more precise. We then have a bunch of functions specific to lists and maps. We're going to talk about these in the next video, but lists are basically arrays, while maps are basically associative arrays. If you've used arrays in other languages such as JavaScript, you will likely already understand that functions that help you manipulate arrays are always going to be useful. Functions which allow you to interact with styles more programmatically are next. Selectors in this case are the name of the class or the ID of the element that any given style is applied to. So we have used button, CTA and so on as selectors in previous videos. We then have some functions which allow you to interact with the structure of the styles itself. So for example, functions exist to check whether a variable has already been created or not. A lot of these are only really useful when it comes to learning a style someone else has created. For example, once a mixin exists, there's no real reason to test whether a mixin exists again, and so the mixin exists function is very limited in scope. At the end of our list of functions, we come across the second talking point of this video, which is the if function. The if function can be written in two different ways, either as a function as you can see in the documentation, or as an @ command, so @if. You may be wondering why you would ever want to use an if statement within a style which isn't going to change once you've finished it, but think of a scenario where you were using other functions to create a specific colour, which you're going to use as a background for a button. You're adding and subtracting all sorts of different colours from one another, and you aren't quite sure exactly what the outcome is going to be. On top of this background, you are going to want to add some text, but because you don't know the exact colour of the background, you can't get a good sense of whether to use a light or dark colour for your text. With an if statement, you could test the colour of the background colour and automatically switch the colour of your text without needing to manually review both styles every time you want to make a change. Finally, before we end this video, I just want to take the opportunity to briefly talk about the native CSS that we're outputting. If we take a look at it, we can see that the styles themselves are laid out differently to normal native CSS. The styles which were indented in the Sass are still indented in the CSS. We do have some options about how the native CSS is structured, and because we're using Koala, we can demonstrate this very easily. By default, Koala uses the nested style for the output CSS. But if we switch this over to expanded, we're going to get something much closer to the more traditional CSS style. If we switch to compact, we're going to move all of the properties associated with each style onto one line, which may make more complex styles more easy to read. Finally, if we set the output to compressed, we're going to end up with what might be referred to as Minified Css. This is just normal CSS with all of the white space taken out. Because the file itself now has no white space, the file itself is much smaller in terms of file size, which is a good thing when your website is on the internet, because there's no point wasting time sending your users data which has literally no purpose. And you can reduce the time it takes to load your web pages, which is always a good thing. It's not exactly easily readable by people, but it's a good thing to do before your website actually goes live. Alternatively, you can always enable the .min.css version of the style by selecting autocompile, and this will create both a compressed version of the style for your web page and a human readable version for you. What do you think of this video? Has it been helpful? Have you learned something new? Let me know in the comments, hit that subscribe button and check out some of these other videos.